Dr. Will Tuttle has been vegan since 1980. He earned his PhD from UC Berkeley and authored The World Peace Diet, which has been translated and published in 16 languages. Will has delivered over 4,000 live audience presentations in over 50 countries worldwide and in all 50 U.S. states, encouraging compassion and vegan living. And he has appeared in many radio, television, print, and online interviews, as well as documentary films including Cowspiracy, Prayer for Compassion, Animals and the Buddha, and others. Dr. Tuttle is a former Zen monk and a musician, a recipient of the Courage of Conscience Award and the Empty Cages Prize, and he's currently organizing the Worldwide Vegan Summit for Truth and Freedom, which is a free online event October 15th till 17th, and he's taken some time today to speak with us. Thank you so much for being here, Will.
Okay, thank you very much, Ginny, and thanks everyone for listening in.
Well, you've been a real inspiration to me. I mean, just your online presence and your book has really inspired me through the years. I just want to say that up front. So usually I start by asking people about their vegan story. I really like to hear those stories. I've heard yours many times, and I know you've told it many, many times. So perhaps instead I'll invite people to go and research some of these online interviews that you've done to hear more about that origin story. And maybe you could tell us instead some of the things that you've learned from intentional vegan communities that you visited throughout your lifetime.
Right, thanks, Janine. Yeah, so sure, the two main intentional vegan communities that I visited in my younger years were the farm in Tennessee. And the story with that, of course, is that my brother and I went, right after I graduated from college, decided we would try to essentially walk from where we grew up, which was in Concord, Massachusetts, so on the east coast of the United States, across to California on the west coast, kind of as a spiritual pilgrimage. This was in 1975, and the hippie movement was going. The war in Vietnam had just ended. I was much protesting against the war and kind of disillusioned with society. So we thought it would be better to have a spiritual path and try to understand more deeply our true nature. So we walked actually quite a ways to about Buffalo, New York. I remember that, Canadian border there. And then we headed south. And we walked all the way to Alabama over quite a few months, heading south. And after several months, we passed through after West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and then into Tennessee. There was a community in Tennessee called The Farm, which was the largest hippie commune in the world back in 1975. They were actually mostly people from California, so there was that feeling of we met them in the middle kind of thing. And they were all vegetarians, and so we were still not vegetarians. But I was considering it, I guess you would say. We were doing a lot of meditating. I didn't like the idea. I was becoming more sensitized to the violence of fishing, the violence of imprisoning animals, and what I knew about it, and killing them, and dairy products, and all that. And so when we found 900 people, basically they said they were vegetarians, but really they were vegans because there was no meat or dairy or eggs on the farm, and pretty much even a lot of the people were wearing shoes that they said were vegetarian. So it was a vegan community. It was just before the word vegan, anyone knew it, so you couldn't use it back then. But that was basically it. So I became a vegetarian through their influence. They had about 200 children that were vegan from birth. They were thriving. They told me about the fact that they were eating lower on the food chain so there would be enough food for everyone to eat. And explain the wastefulness of animal agriculture and how war is caused by the food shortages, caused by the wastefulness of feeding most of the food that we grow to animals while people go hungry. And then they also explained to me the violence in animal agriculture and the routine mutilations and the sexual abuse and all of that. So that was it. It was just great having this living example of 900 people who were totally committed to not only to meditation, which I thought was great, but also to a more compassionate lifestyle. It was based really on the Buddhist teaching of Zen. The Zen Center in San Francisco was really, I think, in some ways the inspiration for some of the main leaders of the community. So I learned about all those things, and I became a vegetarian at that point. And then a few years later, got out to California, and I was living in a Tibetan Buddhist meditation center, and then a Korean Zen meditation center in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then at one point, I decided to just shave my head and become a Zen Buddhist monk. And so I did that. I went to South Korea, and I was living in a monastery in South Korea. And for the second time in my life, I realized I was living in a vegan community. The difference with this one was it went back to the roots. It was been practicing veganism for about almost 800 years. I think it was since the early, like the 1100s, something like that. So instead of being this new kind of hippie idea from California, which is kind of what most people thought of veganism as being at that point, I got this deeper understanding that it is an ancient wisdom tradition that actually goes back thousands of years, and that people who have been serious about spiritual evolution, about emotional clarity, about intellectual illumination, about creating a society of justice and equality and so forth, have understood that animal agriculture and killing animals for food and other products is completely contrary to this, and that it will destroy our efforts to calm our minds and to have a positive society, really, an ultimately positive and sustainable and peaceful society with harmony. So that was it. That kind of really planted the seeds much deeper. I was already a vegan. I had gone vegan in 1980, so I was a vegetarian for 5 years. And then, as many people do, when I went vegan, it was more of a little gradual, because it was like giving up dairy, giving up eggs, giving up wool, silk, leather, just getting rid of all the things. And so it took, about 6 months or a year in there. I just kind of weaned myself off of all of that. And then when I was in Korea, I just went much deeper, and because the community was like that. There was even killing mosquitoes was like forbidden. So it was a really kind of radical vegan community. But I loved it because it was combined with so much meditation. We were getting up at 2:30 in the morning to start the day of meditation, all the way till 9 o'clock at night. So it was very intense, in silence for months on end, for several months anyway. And so that allowed me to go much deeper into exploring my consciousness and realizing how colonized my consciousness had become. Even though I was only in my late 20s at that point, I realized that my mind had been taken over by the Western society's paradigms on every level. So just clearing that out was a great gift, I think, and learning to question some of the internal indoctrination that went along with it.
It's kind of like when we say giving up like dairy and eggs, which we've grown up with and we've learned to enjoy, and they've become part of our routine, and it's kind of like throwing off the shackles, isn't it? It's like you talk about liberating ourselves from this cultural conditioning, and we'll get some more into that. But I'm curious to know, so these two kind of fundamental experiences that you had in these intentional communities, do you know where any of those people are now, and if those communities still exist?
Well, yeah. A few years ago, actually, it was quite a while ago. I mean, it was probably 2011. Okay, so 10 years ago. The World Peace Diet had been out for a few years at that point, and we were doing World Peace Diet facilitator trainings in cities around the United States, and we did one at the farm. So it was really great to go back to the farm. The community was not as large as it was then. It was attacked by the government, and I think really basically by the medical pharmaceutical industry. And so
How so?
Well, it was just part of it was when you have like 800 or 900 or 1,000, it got up to about, I think, 1,400 people. When you have that many people living together, one or two of them can get sick, and it can cost $1 million in medical bills for one person if you don't have insurance, and nobody had insurance.
Right.
So they had one or two people that had big medical bills, and it wiped out the finances of the community. The government started attacking the community on a tax basis and other things. So a lot of people, so they had a lot. So a lot of people had to reduce. Everybody had to become self-sufficient. When I was there, it was like this sort of pure system where you didn't own anything, and if you needed some money, you went to the store and they would give you, or if you needed to buy something, they'd give it to you. It was kind of like whatever you had. It was really very interesting. So they had to go off of that. Everybody had to become sustainable. So there's about 200 people living there now, but it's a thriving community. It's smaller, but it's doing great. They have a beautiful, and they have still the largest vegan book recipe company in North America. It's called the Book Publishing Company. Is still headquartered there. And they put on events and retreats, and so we decided to do an event there. And I worked with this fellow there, who was great. I mean, we put it on. We had about like 30 people came from all over the United States, and we did the event. And I get to meet Stephen, who is kind of the main teacher, and his wife Ina May, who's in charge of the very well-known spiritual midwifery. And the fellow who was helping to put it on, I realized was a person that I had known very well way back in 1975. So it was I didn't realize it till the very end. It's like, oh, you're him. You know, he was the guy that had actually explained to me about the starving people and the vegetarian shoes, and he was actually the fellow. So it all kind of came together. It was very interesting. After all those years, he was still there. And so that community is still going great, and they're even open to having people join them. It's not a pure vegan community now, it's vegetarian, but it's still, most of the people there are vegan. And so it's not, they don't have a policing. Like before it was like, you have to be vegan. You know, now it's more, you know, they encourage it, but it's not absolutely, they don't have police like going in and checking your refrigerator or whatever. So I think, so that was great. And then a few years ago, probably in 2015, I guess, I went back to Korea, and I did a whole lecture tour of Korea, and I went to some of the Zen Buddhist temples, and I went back actually to Songwangsa Monastery where I had been. And I mean, I'm telling you, they have a lot more money now. It looks beautiful. I mean, when I was there, it was kind of funky, but it was great to see. I met even some of the monks that I had known, and one is now the abbot of another monastery. I mean, it was like 35 years later or whatever, so the people are a lot older. But it's great to see that the monks are still vegan, and they love the fact that I was promoting veganism. And I spoke at quite a few of the Zen Buddhist centers in Korea, and then of course a lot of Buddhist centers all over China later. I've been 3 times to China, also Taiwan. I mean, it's like the main religion. It's so great. The main religion in these countries of China and Taiwan, also Vietnam, are vegan. You know, the monks are vegan, the nuns are vegan, and they really helped me to create lecture tours and promote veganism throughout China, actually, many cities in China, also in Taiwan and Vietnam as well.
Do you think there's some connection between, you know, this ancient tradition, and I'm looking forward to hearing you tell us more about the ancient wisdom traditions that you speak of, and how they encourage compassion. But compared to sort of more westernized, modern, individualistic, materialistic, so is there a sense in those other places that you visited that there's more support generally from the government, from, like, you know, they're not going to be taxed to death, for example, there's more encouragement, they're not, I mean, people still kind of laugh at, oh, the hippies, and I'm like, no, hippies were way cool, right? You don't know what some of the things the hippies did. So is there a sense still in these other places, even though Western materialism is creeping in, that there is support for these communities?
Yes, yeah, that's a very beautiful question, very nuanced and somewhat complex. But basically, I would say definitely yes. There are, like when we were in China, I was glad to see that there are, in every city, there are these centers of traditional wisdom. Sometimes there's Buddhist monasteries and Buddhist centers, and I spoke at a lot of those. But there's also just these centers. It's kind of hard. They translate like traditional wisdom centers, something like that. And so they kind of combine Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so forth. And it's mostly, kind of middle-aged to older people, but they really are so loving and so enthusiastic. And that's somewhat supported by the government. I think there's this sort of sense that there's a traditional wisdom in China. Also, I felt that in Korea, Taiwan, these other places, that's really precious. So one of the things I actually did quite often there, also in India and other countries with these traditions, I pleaded with them to honor their traditions and don't be so quick to feel they have to abandon, just jettison everything and embrace the Western medical model, the Western governmental model, the Western economic, political, social, familial models that are, and the media and the entertainment. I mean, it's just hitting them so hard that this is superior, that we have the way to live in the West, and I think it was great, I think, for them, really, in terms of their self-confidence, perhaps, to see a Westerner coming there who's, I have a PhD and all of that, and well respected here, and tell them, listen, we need to learn from you. You have, in many ways, been the way showers. You've been holding the light for us in terms of compassion for animals, in terms of a more introspective approach to living, of taking responsibility for your own feelings, also systems that are more based on social cohesion and social cooperation, and a more, I think, in some ways, honoring the wisdom of the collective or of the group, in a sense. So I told them, I think, that there's a lot of gold in your, don't go away and think that you have to become like us, because especially when it comes to food, the food is probably the worst thing that the West is offering. This fast food and meat, dairy, and eggs, and so I really feel that, and still I think it's a very important thing.
And so, at what point in your life did you and Madeline find each other?
That was actually, yeah, it was in right around 1990. I had gotten my PhD at Berkeley at that point, and I was teaching college in San Francisco Bay Area, and it was going great, but I decided to take a break and a sabbatical, basically, and I was also very involved with it was called then citizen diplomacy effort to try to make peace with Russia. There was this whole fear of a nuclear war with Russia, and they were the evil empire. And I kept thinking, I love these Russian people. I had met them. They had come over here. We had done things like in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. We would plant trees together, and then we would go over there and plant trees together in Russia. And we were kind of doing these citizen exchange programs. So I went over to Russia in a citizen exchange program and gave concerts and played the piano in Moscow, in Armenia, and different places. And as part of that, I traveled around Europe to France and Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and it was called Yugoslavia back then. And so I met Madeline in Switzerland just sort of by chance. I was just playing the piano in this one little town we stopped in Switzerland. They had a Waldorf school with a grand piano, and so I was playing there in the evenings for the 4 or 5 days. My brother and I were there, and it just so happened there was an art gallery opening, and she was there for this art gallery opening and asked about the music that I was playing, and I told her it was original music, and so she bought one of my cassettes that I happened to have with me. And then when I get back to the United States, instead of going back to teaching, I decided to start my own independent lecture tour on educating intuition, because I had my PhD in intuition and promoting veganism. So I was living in a 1971 Volkswagen bus and traveling around to progressive centers, to Unitarian churches and unity churches and yoga studios and conferences and things, and lecturing and giving concerts and playing the piano. And this woman from Switzerland wrote to me and said, gosh, I really love your music. Can you make a CD? And I was already thinking it's time to make a CD. And I said, well, I need art for the cover. And she said, I'm an artist. So at one point she said, well, I can come over and maybe we can work on it together. And I said, well, I'm living in a Volkswagen bus. I don't know where I'm going to put you. She said, don't worry. I've been living in grass shacks in Kenya and longhouses in Borneo. I've traveled the world. I've lived in little vans in New Zealand and Australia. I won't be any trouble to you. And I thought, I don't know about that. But anyway, she came over, and she moved into the Volkswagen bus with me. And then we ended up getting a little house in Northern California, renting a little place and getting a grand piano. And I really hit it off. We fell in love, got married. And it turned out, actually, when she was a little girl of 5 years old, she heard a melody, and she always loved that music, and she could never find it anywhere. And she had even, when she was in her 20s, she had her own music store. And she still couldn't find that melody. So she said, when I sat at the piano and played at that Waldorf school it was actually in Interlaken, that was the music that she had heard when she was 5 years old, that she'd been searching for her whole life. Wow. So it was one of those cosmic things that, like, this is not just an accident here.
That's
and
amazing.
So we've been together now for 29 years. We've been married. And it's been really, I feel like the smartest thing I ever did besides going vegan was marrying this wonderful woman. She's a great artist, a wonderful partner, and chef, and music. She plays the flute now too, and cook and gardener. And so we ended up living in an RV for 18 years and traveling around the United States and sharing the message. And now we have a house and a garden here in Northern California, and we're here about half the time or so now.
And you're off grid with a food forest, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we get all our energy from the sun. We have a house battery, and we have a food forest that we've been working on here. We've been here for about 8 years now, or almost 9 years actually. And we've planted about 70 fruit and nut trees, lots of berries, we have 5 beds for vegetables. And so we're really working on that to try to become as self-sufficient as possible for food and for energy, and definitely for information, and not rely on the centralized food, energy, information systems, because I think they've really been corrupted. So,
yeah, that's, and you talk it somewhere in one of your talks. You talk about that your dad was involved in media somehow, and so you saw at a young age how media works.
yeah, my father's interesting. He wanted to be a doctor, actually, originally, and so he had become a medic. He was a medic in the army, in the U.S. Army in World War II, and so he was actually over in France and Germany. Over there, and he he didn't like it. He didn't like being a doctor. He said all he did was give people shots all day. And he was giving them all, and he said, I don't think it was good. I think they were getting sick from all these shots. So he said to us as we were growing up as little kids, he always encouraged us to never go to the doctor. Just stay away from these doctors. Try to take responsibility for your health, and don't spend time going to doctors if you can. So we really didn't. We went to doctors occasionally for a checkup, but for the most part we kind of stayed out of it. But he went into journalism. He bought a newspaper when I was a little kid, and by the time I was 18 years old or so, he had a chain of 13 newspapers in the Concord, Massachusetts area, these like local newspapers. And so I learned early on, besides not trusting doctors, not to trust the media either. Because I learned, basically, you cannot run any media, I mean, newspaper, magazine, television, whatever, radio, without advertising. You have these advertisers, and the advertisers determine what the news is going to be. He would talk to my mother, and he'd say, well, we can't run that news article because the advertiser so-and-so wouldn't like it, and if they pull their ads, we'll go out of business. So I got an inside look sort of from behind the curtain, that you got to make sure that the news is not going to make any of your advertisers look bad. And the advertisers were all the businesses. And today, the biggest advertisers, as we know, are the pharmaceutical and banking and petrochemical. These huge companies are advertising. And so I've learned to really question the media, because I know in my bones and in my blood, it's basically just the voice of whoever's advertising. And these advertisers have an agenda that's not necessarily in our best interest. As a vegan, I understand that very well. And I think all of us, whether we're vegan or not, need to be aware of this.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think hopefully people are waking up to take a more critical view of the media, and especially now that there's all this censorship going on what are meant to be independent platforms that were ostensibly created to allow for independent voices, and now even those independent voices are being censored. And it's interesting to consider how this censorship works on a personal level, like that self-censorship. You know, your father saying, well, I get money from these people, so I don't want to offend them, and that's a natural response. And so that really is happening on a very large scale, is what's happening, I think, having worked in the media myself as well. All right, well, let's get into the source of all of this. Will, I really like to look at root causes and dig into, like, what are we as humans? How did we get here? Or, like, how did we get to this place of near extinction? And really, it's 10,000 years. We can look at 10,000 years, I think, of animal agriculture, right? And you've done a lot of research and reporting, and the World Peace Diet is full of information about this. So what should we think about in this time about the roots of this patriarchal culture?
Right. Well, that's actually great. You framed the question very well, I think. And in the World Peace Diet, of course, I talk about this. I won't go into it in too much depth, but basically, if we look to the roots of the dilemmas that we're having now, I would say they're definitely in animal agriculture. That's the core. The living core of the society that we live in is herding animals. But we don't know that. That basic fact is hidden from us. The most basic, obvious fact. I think if people came from outer space, they look around, they'd see, gosh, there's this one species and they're killing billions of animals. And it takes most of the land, most of the water, most of the petroleum. And it's causing disease and devastation. To us, it's very kind of bizarrely invisible. We don't really recognize it. We don't see it. We just think, oh, we're living in a computerized, industrialized society, which is true. The animal agriculture is now computerized and industrialized. The animals are stuck away in these stinking sheds where they never see the light of day. But most of the land, we learned that as we traveled around in our RV, most of the land has been reduced to monocropped fields of genetically engineered corn and soy and alfalfa and other feed grains. 85% of the food we're growing, we're feeding to these animals. It's enormously wasteful and devastating on every level to our health, to the environmental health, to our cultural health, and I also would say to our psychological health and our spiritual health, our ethical health, because we have to numb ourselves and disconnect from our natural intelligence in order to even to support the system, or I think in some ways even just to live in the same society where this is happening. But historically, if we go back about 10,000 years, we see the very roots of animal agriculture for the very first time in what is today the Western, the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. They're that Western Asia, what is today Iraq, actually. People for the first time started to own wild sheep and then wild goats and then cows and then other animals. That initiated sort of this domino effect in a way, like a bunch of different things happened very gradually over hundreds of years, really thousands of years, that have led us to where we are now. And we're, I think, in serious trouble in a very real way, existential way. It started off just owning these animals, and anthropologists don't really know why this started, but they started owning animals as property. That led to the reduction of the status of animals, so animals began to be seen merely as either property or as pests. Either we own them as wealth, or they may interfere with our property. So we want to eliminate and eradicate the wolves and coyotes and prairie dogs and all these other animals that somehow threaten our wealth. And then the other ones are owned, and so their status drops and they become merely property, and it's sold by the pound. I mean, really, totally, we don't see them as beings anymore. And then that led also to the rise for the very first time on planet Earth of a wealthy elite class that was wealthy and powerful and dominated their societies because they owned the most capital. And we have capital being a word from Latin that means head, as in head of sheep and goats and cows. And so these wealthy proto-capitalists, and you can read about them if you read the ancient texts, like I used to teach college courses in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad, the Odyssey, the ancient Old Testament writings. You see these kings, they're always going to war. So they invented war, and war was a way to expand their wealth, as a way to get more livestock, more capital. The ancient word for war, the first word for war that we know of, really, gavia, means the desire for more cows. And that led also to human slavery, because it's a small step from doing to animals to do the same thing to do to other human beings. So owning them as property, whoever lost the war, the animals would become the property of the victors, and the people would become the property of the victors, and then they would work in the fields and they would work in the home. So they became owned as property. They were also bred, just like animals were bred. So we had this sexual abuse of animals, the sexual abuse of humans. And then that led to the loss of the status of women, because the whole of animal agriculture, it has three component parts, right? We have, number one, we have the imprisonment of other living beings, of animals. Number two, we have the killing of them, right, for food. But the third leg of that, of those three things, that's really important, is the breeding of these animals. And you can't have the other two without that. So the core, really, of animal agriculture is sexually abusing female animals. You impregnate them against their will, you steal their babies and kill their babies, and you do that over and over again. So the sexual abuse of animals, I think the female began to be seen as merely a breeder. And so we read again in these ancient texts, not only are cows and sheep and goats sold like property, but women also become chattel property. And so we have the arising of a very violent, bellicose, patriarchal bunch of societies that spread from the Eastern Mediterranean to Europe, basically, in Northern Europe to Central Asia, and then of course spread from there to North and South America, and in many ways still spreading through these corporations, ConAgra, Cargill, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, the financial institutions, the governmental agencies. It's still spreading today. I call this whole thing the military, industrial, meat, medical, pharmaceutical, media, banking complex, which controls, and it's really in some ways a monolithic entity with different tentacles. And animal agriculture is really, in many ways, the heart and soul and core of this entire thing. It's where people get exploited, because when you have human beings exploiting other beings, the fundamental truth on this planet is, I guess you could say, is karma. It's whatever you sow, you're going to reap. I call it the boomerang effect. Whatever goes out comes back. Whatever, what goes around comes around. So when you get everyone exploiting animals, then they're sowing the seeds of their own exploitation. And so now I say we've been seeing the exploitation of humans growing. The slavery of humans is actually probably more than ever. We have more trafficking and slavery of humans probably than ever in history. War, of course, is ongoing. And the wealthy elite class is more wealthy and elite than ever. I mean, the tiny minority now has most of the wealth and controls the media and controls the narrative. And whoever controls the narrative in a society pretty much controls the society. So we can trace this back 10,000 years, and we can see how we've been trying to create more justice and more freedom and more equality, and yet we keep eating animal foods, which is the opposite of justice and equality. And so we don't seem to be making a lot of progress. And now we have a technology and a very large number of people. So I think we can see these problems compounding right before our very eyes, especially in the last few years.
Mm. Yeah, and you've spoken about that a lot. What we do to animals, we do to ourselves, and we can see that directly every day in the food choices that we make. That's a simple solution. We can, right. With some exception, we can all quickly change that. We can, and it is changing, and that's really fantastic, I think. There's other things going on, though. There's the whole animal testing world, And I'm not sure we focus too much on that in the vegan community. And especially now with the big pharma solutions that are being presented to us, it concerns me that there's all kinds of animal testing going on. And at the same time, there's a bit of a division in the vegan community. So there are vegans who are listening to the dominant corporate media that is fueled by big pharma, that's saying this is the path, this is the way out of our current problem. And then there's vegans who are saying, you know what, I'm still not convinced that that's the solution, and I trust my body, and I trust the earth, and I'm not afraid, and I want to be able to control my own health. And in the background of all of that is this ongoing, and they're using primates too, right, for this perpetual animal testing. I'm just wondering if you've pondered that. What do you have to say about that?
Thank you. Yeah, well, I actually have been an outspoken critic of vivisection for decades. I write about this in the World Peace Diet also, that the fundamental premise of vivisection is wrong when you think about what I just said, that the foundation of every ancient wisdom tradition is this basic teaching of the golden rule, right? I mean, the basic teaching of whatever you sow, so shall you reap. Don't do to others what you would not want to have done to yourself. We know now beyond the shadow of a doubt that animals are conscious. I mean, even science finally has agreed to that point, that they have interests, that anyone who has had a companion animal, for example, knows for sure that there's someone behind those eyes looking out, right? And that they have interests that are as important to them as my interests are to me. So if we are, again, going to insist that we have the right to use these animals and to harm them for our benefit, right? Vivisection, the use of animals in laboratory tests for products, for drugs, and so forth, is extremely stressful and painful to these animals. It's just being born into, not just like in the food system where you're born to be killed. In vivisection, you're really born to be tortured and then killed. And so these animals are forced to have all kinds of diseases inflicted on their bodies. And then drugs, for example, are tested to see how if they help with these diseases that are inflicted on these animals. So from a point of view of basic wisdom, my question has always been, how do we ever expect that we will become more healthy by inflicting disease and misery on other beings, right? I mean, that goes completely against the basic logic. The way we all know that if we want to be loved, the best way to be loved is to be loving. If we want to be free, the best way to be free is to let others be free. We all know this in our daily life. If we want to have an abundant life, then be generous. Whatever we give comes back. We know that. So how can we think that we can take these living beings, animals, like you say, monkeys, but even other animals like mice and rats or dogs? I mean, these are all used. Ferrets, all kinds of animals are used in animal testing for pharmaceutical drugs and for products in general. Rabbits, of course. And if you're going to harm them so that you'll be healthy, you're going to throw them into the opposite of safety, right? I mean, into complete danger and death and killing, and that we're going to somehow be safe by doing that. On that level alone, it's completely wrong-headed. But veganism, essentially, as an ethical system, is foundational, I think, to our spiritual and ethical and cultural wisdom. And so what veganism is actually the ancient teaching of ahimsa in many ways. Ahimsa is the old Sanskrit word that means nonviolence, the basic teaching that we're not going to be actually happy or fulfilled if we're violent, if we harm others for our own benefit, if we kill others for our own benefit, steal from them, abuse them sexually, lie to them, deceive them, all these things, sexually abuse them. we know every religion and even our own non-religious awareness knows that that is not the way to create a society of harmony and peace. But somehow we think that we can do that with these animals, and so it's really troubling to me to see people who call themselves vegans, for example, who won't eat meat, dairy, and eggs, saying, well, I have no problem with vivisection, that because we want to have these drugs to keep us safe. We should really question that, because it's like the dairy industry. There's people who say, well, I just need to have dairy. I just need it, so I'm going to drink dairy because I need the calcium. And vegans say, well, no, really you don't. No, I really do. Okay, so I really need animal protein. I really need to have these drugs tested on animals. People, Germany in the 30s, they we really need to test on these people in the concentration camps, because we can really learn some things that could help save us, right? We universally condemn that now. Well, why don't we condemn it when it comes to animals who also are just as capable of misery? And we know, I think in our bones, that this is not going to help. This never helps. And what we see happening is that we have more diseases today than we've ever had. There's an absolute explosion of diseases that never existed in the past. The more we inflict disease on animals, the more we find humanity suffering from disease. The more we make the animals obese, I talk about this in the World Peace Diet. We have an obesity epidemic. The more we give them osteoporosis, the more we give them cancer, which we do. We give cancer not in factory farms, but also in laboratories. We force them to have cancer so we can treat it. We force them to smoke cigarettes, so we force them to get drunk. We force them in all kinds of drugs that cause them incredible suffering. We can't even conceive of the amount of suffering. And we're not talking about just a few animals. We're talking about millions of animals every year are killed in vivisection. And they give it this pseudo-religious overtone, like we're sacrificing the animals. We're the priests. We use these animals almost in a shamanic way, and this is something that I think we have to understand. I used to teach college courses in world mythology, and there's a very mythical element to all of this, that God has given us these animals, that we can sacrifice them, we can have our sins go onto them, and then we kill them, that kind of thing, like they're sacrificial. And so we force them to be sick and diseased to somehow expiate our own guilt or expiate our own tendency to have a disease. So it's very disturbing to me to see, for example, the Vegan Society based in England, founded by Donald Watson, actually publicly proclaiming that, well, it doesn't matter. In this case, vivisection is good. It has our blessing because we have diseases that are so serious now that we just need to use animals for that. And I think that the money and the power of these large corporations does directly and indirectly infiltrate movements. It's definitely infiltrated the environmental movement. It's definitely infiltrated the peace movement. It's definitely, I think, infiltrated the vegan movement by people who are either knowingly or unknowingly serving as basically shills for the pharmaceutical industry within our movement. And we need to, I think, just stay vigilant, remember the principles that we're standing upon, and take responsibility for our health. And I think we should. I personally have not gone to a pharmaceutical store, like a drugstore, in 48 years, ever. Since before I was vegetarian even, to get anything.
Yeah, same.
Partly because I really make an effort to only eat organic, whole, plant-based foods, and to do a lot of exercise every day, to really make sure my relationships are in harmony, and to do everything I possibly can to ensure that my physical health is good, great, fantastic. It really is, actually. And I think all of us can do that. We have a tendency to want to take the easy way out, I think, to be comfortable and become a victim. Like, oh, I was attacked by these bad bacteria, or I have bad genes, it's not my fault, so now I need to have some drugs, and that's going to help me. And just because it's tested on animals, well, that doesn't matter because I'm a victim. I what it takes to be healthy, and we're supposed to, have sympathy for people who don't want to take responsibility for their health. And I think it's playing right into the hands of the pharmaceutical, medical, banking complex that has its beady little eyes on animals and ecosystems and profits and humanity, really. And to stand up and say, like Gandhi said, he said, I would rather become sick or even die than to harm an animal to get a medication, right? I mean, to me, that's a very noble thing. Why is my life worth more than that in other being's life? Why am I so arrogant to think that, well, I'm much more important? I'm made in the image and likeness, right? And they weren't, or something, whatever it is. Or we're Homo sapiens sapiens. We're the really wise ones. We're the superior ones. We can do whatever we want to these animals. I mean, vegans have to be ashamed of themselves, I think, for going along with this narrative that is harming millions of animals, and it's not going to stop. It's going to continue and grow if we don't really understand this and talk about it.
Yeah, and I think it's really fear driven, and the powers that be really encourage that fear of death. Like, I think I practiced yoga and meditation, pranayama, and I think that has really helped me release this fear of death. When you go into that sattvic state and you just feel the connection with the universe, and you feel quiet and still, and realize that's probably as close to death as I can get in this lifetime. And there's nothing scary about that. Like, that doesn't scare me. It's the chatter in my brain that will incessantly tell me I'm doing it wrong and I'm not good enough and I should be doing it this way and I need to be afraid of these people and these things. And that's the scary part to me. And so it seems like there's definitely a difference between religion and spirituality, right? And religion seems to encourage fear, whereas spirituality is more of a self-awareness, a way of liberating ourselves. Is there? How do we find that in our society that's constantly bombarding us, and especially in these times? Well,
right. You're making a really good point, and I've been saying it for years that the only reason people don't go vegan, there's only one reason, and it's fear. If you really get down to it, it's fear. They're afraid. That's why they don't go vegan. And they're afraid of whatever it is. They have their self-image, or what other people will think, or they're not going to have the foods that they like, or it's too cumbersome, or whatever it is. But it's always fear. And so vegans, I have to hand it to vegans. The people who go vegan are able to overcome that fear. But that doesn't mean we have overcome all our fears. And so I've always said veganism is a two-step process. The first step is the one that's sort of in the outer, like I don't eat meat, dairy, or eggs. I don't use wool, silk, or leather. I don't buy products tested on animals. I don't go to the rodeo and the zoo and the circus and all that. Okay, that's great. I mean, good for you. But that's the first step. The second step is what you're talking about, which is to go much deeper. And this step really is important, where we begin to question the narratives in our head that have been planted there by well-meaning people like our mothers and fathers and teachers and I don't know if they're well-meaning, some of the advertisements on TV, that if you have a cold, run to the doctor, go, all these, go to church. I mean, going to church isn't bad, but that somehow spirituality, for example, could be found in religion, and not necessarily, like you say. The thing about religion, I'll just say it, I think you can sum it up maybe in this basic idea, which is that there's two forces at work in religion. And one of them is spirituality, which is the authentic awakening of consciousness to its source, to the truth that what we are was never born and will never die. What we are is infinite and eternal consciousness that is manifesting through a physical vehicle. But that's not what we are. We are not this thing, this object, this matter. But since we live in a materialistic society, it's probably the most materialistic society in the history of the world, where for 10,000 years we've been selling animals by the pound. You can't get more materialistic than that. So after that kind of momentum, we've even look at ourselves like we're just something you could sell by the pound practically. We sell ourselves by a resume or something, but we turn ourselves into objects. So what religion does is it has, like I say, these two aspects. It does have spirituality as part of its mission, but religion also is an institution within society, and society is organized at its core around animal agriculture. So religion is also an institution that is dedicated to promoting the I call it the father, the overarching cultural norms. And so because of that, when you go to church, you have the fish fry and the barbecue, and people don't ever really talk typically about the abuse of animals, because religion is to make us fit into our society, to be part of society, to get along with society. And so these two go against each other. I mean, these two tendencies. And so religion is conflicted. Religion has this conflicted aspect. It does have teachings that, if you really read them and practice them, will lead to authentic spiritual awakening and breakthrough and healing. But it also has teachings designed to numb us down and disconnect us and keep us part of the society. And it really is which one are you going to emphasize? So I think that it's essential that as vegans that we do our best to access authentic spirituality, which is veganism. Veganism at its core is caring. It's love for other expressions of life. That's spirituality. It's seeing that we all have the same source. When we see another living being, we don't see this thing that I can use. We see another expression of life, and we naturally have a sense of inclusion and sense of kindness and compassion. It's looking beyond the surface to the being itself. So it's cultivating a sense of depth and a quality of caring and compassion. So that goes right along with true spirituality. So it's a tremendous wound in our movement that so many vegans are anti-spiritual, right? What they mean to be, I guess, is anti-religion in a certain sense, but they're even anti-spiritual. They're pro-materialistic. That's crazy. I mean, to be a vegan and be pro-materialistic, that's being pro-animal agriculture. Animal agriculture is materialism, and it's, I would say, also satanic or demonic in the sense that it allows us to sexually abuse and kill and torture other beings without feeling bad about it, right? We just say we have a narrative that just lets us, well, we need the protein, we need the calcium, or we need to be healthy, or we're superior, whatever it is. That is all anti-spiritual, and there are unfortunately, a lot of vegans who don't take the second step, who make an outer move of some kind, but still harbor all of this conflicted narrative that they've inhaled from their society. And it seems to me, also, I'll just say this, that younger people in our, like, I'm almost 70, right? So I'm like, I feel like I'm still 20, but that's the chronological age here. That kids in earlier, that are coming now, younger people in their, teens or 20s or 30s or 40s or whatever, even 50s, they came through an educational system, and I think a medical system that was more harsh and more wounding of them than I experienced, right? I mean, I only had a couple of, I didn't have much of a run-in with the medical establishment. I wasn't vaccinated many times. I mean, I just kind of, we never locked the door on the house. We ran around. There were no seatbelts, no helmets. I mean, it was really kind of a time of more freedom, I guess, when I was a kid growing up. And I see young people now in the educational system. I mean, my PhD is in education, and I think the education more than ever is about, like you say, censorship of thinking freely, not thinking critically, not questioning authority. It's much more about just going along with authority. I mean, it's always been that way, but my feeling is that the screws have been tightened more as the years go by. It gets more and more harsh on human beings that are born. And so I really reach out with great love and compassion and caring for younger people who are anti-religious and anti-spiritual. I understand that. But I also feel like if you can question the indoctrination of our society at a deeper level and realize that the media is not your friend and these industries are not your friends, they are really captured by these very corrupt powers. And to take time to meditate and do yoga, like you're saying, and other disciplines that'll help the mind be quiet and reconnect with its source, this pure awareness, and get a glimpse of the eternal beauty of your true being, the sky that's always, in a sense, covered over by the clouds of conditioning. And if you can let go of those clouds of conditioning a little bit through a meditation retreat or through spending time in nature, to disconnect from the cell phones and all this complete, we're just being bombarded by stimuli from the outside. And there's a reason for that. We're under pressure economically and all these ways, and that keeps us, I think, in a certain prison. So what you're talking about, I think, Janine, is the essence of the problem. There are ancient wisdom traditions that we can connect with, and we can authentically understand within our own consciousness the truth that they were pointing at. And I think modern science at its best can point in that way, but science itself has been almost completely corrupted as well. So when people say that science says something, you got to be really careful
Right.
about that, because it's basically bought out. Yeah.
Which science, right? There's so many. Just because somebody's in a lab with a lab coat, it doesn't mean what they're doing is science, I've heard it said, right? And there's so much information. That's kind of the strange irony at this time. You know, we do have this technology, and it is an amazing tool. I mean, we're able to connect with people all over the world, and we're able to do our own research. So let's at least take advantage of that, I think. And I'm really excited about the Worldwide Vegan Summit for Truth and Freedom coming up. So this sounds like a really great place. Take the whole weekend off. Just tune in, tune out. Or what was the old saying? Tune out and tune in, or something?
Yeah, Timothy Leary said, tune in, turn on, drop out. And I think that's actually good advice. I'm thinking about tuning in means kind of connecting with the more subtle dimension of your consciousness. Turn on, that means enliven yourself, connect with the source of enthusiasm and joy and freedom and creativity within yourself. And drop out, that means disconnect from the corrupt system of exploitation and violence. And really that's what veganism has always been about. It's not supporting financially or psychologically systems of violence and abuse. Don't support them. Systems of slavery and imprisonment. Do the best we can to create alternatives to that. Create vegan restaurants, create vegan festivals, create vegan meals, vegan coaching, vegan relationships based on kindness, respect, and inclusion of other living beings. And it's always been about freedom and sovereignty, that the only way we can dominate and exploit animals is by stealing their sovereignty. So the Worldwide Vegan Summit for Truth and Freedom is, I just felt, all right, somebody's got to do this. I guess I'll volunteer and do it. So it's a summit that's coming up soon, October 15th to 17th here, 2021. And I've recruited 16 people, myself included, so 15 other vegans. These are all people who are well known and respected within the vegan community, but are also outspoken advocates of health freedom. And I think these two go together. A lot of people in the vegan community think they don't go together, but I think they really go together. If we're concerned about being healthy and living a life of kindness and compassion and caring for animals, then I think we're also naturally really care about human and human freedom. Because how can we ever be an effective voice for animals, an advocate for animals, if we don't have freedom of speech, if we don't have freedom of assembly, if we don't have freedom of religion, if we don't have the basic freedoms that are guaranteed, basically have been anyway, by our constitutions and by our governments and so forth. Now we see them being taken away because of the fear of microbes and so forth. But underlying all of that is the beautiful beacon, I would say, that veganism is sending out the light of freedom for all beings, that we don't use these excuses to take away other beings' sovereignty. And so people like T. Colin Campbell, Dr. Joel Kahn, Dr. Gabriel Cousens, Dr. Brian Clement, Dr. Pam Popper, Dr. Nihal Parikh, Claire Mann from Australia, and Hannah Maria from Spain, Margarita Restrepo of Naked Food Magazine from Italy now, and a number of other people from other countries. We have Derek Burrows from Mexico, and people from all over the world, mostly from the United States, but lots all over the world actually, and so who are advocating, I think, in a very bold and courageous way, compassion for animals and freedom and truth in our relationships with each other and in the media. So please join us if you have any interest in these interconnections, how really our violence towards animals boomerangs back on us, the way we throw them into diseases, into all kinds of disease, and now we're getting disease. We take away their freedoms, we lose our freedoms. I've been saying for decades in my lectures that if we human beings are going to insist on our superiority to exploit other animals and to imprison them, why do we think we're going to be free from the same thing happening to us? That we're going to be viewed as livestock, essentially, by beings who look at us like livestock. And if we're going to insist on force medicating them against their will, we might find that happen. If we're going to insist on tracking them everywhere, that might happen. If we're going to insist on microchipping them all the time, that might happen. If we're going to insist on all these things, imprisoning them, and so forth, stealing their babies, we see all these things happening to animals, of course, but we see it happening more and more in our human world very clearly. And so I think veganism is the most precious movement. I've always said veganism is the most precious movement because it's the only one that goes to the root of our problems. And it's still the only one that goes to the root of our problems. And yet I find a lot of vegans don't want to go to the root of the problems. They'd rather stay comfortably unaware, just the way we say non-vegans are comfortably unaware. We're not be comfortably unaware and just be comfortable and just go along with the social narrative that promotes violence. And so I've realized, in being a vegan activist for 40 years, that it's really, in many ways, the pharmaceutical industry that is most hostile to veganism, even more than the meat, dairy, and egg industries. Because the meat, dairy, and egg industries are still food industries. A lot of these meat, dairy, and egg industries are actually investing in and even creating their own plant-based meat, or plant-based dairy, plant-based eggs, all these things. They can make money. They don't have to have animals. They can have plant-based alternatives. But the pharmaceutical industry is a subset of the chemical industry, which is a subset of the petroleum industry, the petrochemical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry makes its money on animal agriculture. Without animal agriculture, its worst nightmare is vegans like me who take responsibility for their health, right? I've given no money in 50 years into their pockets. I've not gone to a drugstore, doctor, or anything. And I've not bought any animal-based foods, because there's three main ways that the pharmaceutical industry makes all of its money. Number one is there's over 10,000 different drugs and hormones and chemicals that have been approved to be used on the imprisoned cows and pigs and chickens and factory farm fishes that people are eating. So they're making huge profits on antibiotics and growth hormones and all these chemicals and things used on these animals. Then people eat that stuff and get sick, right? So they have huge profits for drugs, for heart disease, for breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, liver disease, kidney disease, dementia, all the things caused by eating diets rich in animal-based foods. And then their biggest profits really come from the sale of drugs for depression and anxiety, the same thing that we're inflicting on these animals, right? So as I say, as we sow, we reap. So we have all these human beings inflicting depression and anxiety and insomnia on animals who are driven into psychological misery. and then we eat that stuff, and we want to have drugs and anxiety. And of course, in the background, the pharmaceutical industry is making money everywhere, right? They make money on the more sick and violent people are, the more money they make. They don't make money on healthy, happy people. They make money on unhappy, miserable people. They make money, they spew, and their sister or brother, whatever it is, corporations like Monsanto and other DuPont, they spray chemicals into the environment and make people sick. Well, that's good for their business too. So all of this, we have to understand, this all works together, and they control the media. They control the narrative about this. So we're in a dangerous situation with this whole thing, and we have to be vigilant, and I would say courageous, and do what vegans have always done, which is don't comply. Don't go along. I don't eat dairy. I don't do this. I don't do that. I just don't go along with the narrative, because that is not in our best interest, not in best interest of future generations, of animals, of ecosystems, and it all ends up in the earth, back in the earth. I mean, all the drugs that people take, they end up in the environment, they end up in the water, they cause harm to animals, and poisons just harm everybody. So try to understand these things, please, and do the best you can to refrain from supporting industries of violence that poison not only the outer world, but poison the inner landscape of our awareness, that poison our conversations, that censor our conversations. You got to remember, when anyone says they're censoring misinformation, they're lying. Censors are always lying. Anyone who wants censorship is lying because they're afraid of the truth. There's a great saying by St. Augustine. He said, "Truth is like a lion. Just let it be free. It can take care of itself. It can defend itself." They don't want the truth coming out, and that's why we have censorship, and that's why, as you're saying, Janine, there's this push to silence people and call what they're saying misinformation or hate speech or some kind of a thing. No. I mean, really, we have to understand that the truth, when it's spoken, can defend itself, and anyone who's trying to suppress that has an agenda and has a pretext that they're trying to defend.
Yeah, censorship is never a solution. We're grown-ups. We can decide for ourselves what we want to tune into and what we don't want to believe, and what we censorship. That's a very important concern as well. And in a similar way that the animals have been silenced, right? Going back to your analogy, that now we're silencing ourselves. Yeah. So much to think about. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. So the Worldwide Vegan Summit for Truth and Freedom, it's free. It's online, October 15th to 17th. There's a website. People can just search for that and then sign up, and then they're good to go.
Yes, exactly. I think, one place people can go is our website, which is pretty easy to remember, worldpeacediet.com. If you go to my name, willtuttle.com, that'll take you there too. And then right at the top of that page, there's a link to the Worldwide Vegan Summit for Truth and Freedom. So that's one way you can get there. But it's going to be up this weekend, and we've been kind of spreading the word. So you may get if you're in the vegan community, you may get an email about it from somebody. And but you can go search for that, and it'll be this weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, the 17th. All day, every day, we've got a day for focusing on health and vegan health and health freedom, basically. A day for focusing on science, so that's Friday, and then Saturday is focusing on science, or what really is science, and then Sunday is really focusing on the deeper narrative of how veganism and health freedom work together. So we have speakers that focus on these three different main areas. And I'm really thrilled, actually, to see the progress that we're making. I think it's easy nowadays to get discouraged and to see, gosh, it looks like it's such a hard time to be alive and so forth. But to realize that on a deep level, perhaps we do have what it takes to be alive during this time and be part of the solution to the problems that we're having, to speak our mind, speak our truth, to do the best we can to live in harmony with what veganism is, which is compassion and kindness, and speaking up for those who are really at our mercy. And I think the more we do that, the more we'll find our community growing, and that it is possible that out of the, in a sense, the crumbling, I think is happening in many ways, of a system that's very harmful and violent, as that begins to continue to collapse, out of that we can build something beautiful. And every day we can be part of that solution in our relationships with each other, in our purchases. I encourage everyone to do what you can to grow your own food, to become more self-reliant, to support local communities of resilience, support the alternative information networks, farmers markets, just become more decentralized. There's a big push to centralize. So I think it's decentralization is within the spirit of veganism, because it's much less violent when we're actually working face-to-face with other people without any impediment, really talking to each other directly. That's how we get back in touch. There's a big emphasis on trying to isolate the individual, to make us afraid of each other, to reduce our solidarity, to make us to divide our movements. It's this whole divide and conquer thing. So to remember to be loving with each other. I think that's a key thing in veganism. It's not just being loving to animals, but really with each other as well. Have compassion. We're all under quite a bit of stress with this whole situation. So have compassion, and remember that in general, the way social media works, it brings out the worst in us. So do the best you can to talk to people directly, or at least on the telephone or whatever, but to be loving in all of your interactions as much as possible, and understanding, and be less quick to judge and censor or condemn, because that's what the agenda is. And the only way that a few can control the many is through that kind of a way of operating. So it's beautiful what you're doing, Janine. I really appreciate your efforts, and it's so great to see alternative media that is holding the high watch to help us remember the truth that the key to everything is don't comply with the voices and forces. I remember practicing civil disobedience. We just don't obey. Don't obey. There's a great wisdom in not obeying orders that tell us to harm other beings, for example, or to shut down our own sovereignty, or to shut down our connection with each other, and to question those orders. It's very important. And I think the research that's been done on human compliance shows that we kind of hardwired at a deep level to just do what authorities say, and to just be agents of violence. If someone tells me to do it, to just do it. So that's where we really get the test. I think that's where we really separate the wheat from the chaff. People who, even they get an order from the authorities to harm others, or to shut down their compassion, to give up their sovereignty, if we can stand up to authority and say no, then that shows that we're living our life. And as you say, when we leave our body, and we're all going to do that. I mean, that's guaranteed. That's what we all share. We're going to leave our body at one point. And at that point, when we look back on our life, we'll have a sense of respect for our life, and a sense that we lived our life rather than came here and just were part of the problem and harmed others because we were afraid to resist the voices of violence and authority. Our only true authority is our own spiritual light inside of us. If we follow that, then this incarnation will be a blessing, and that's the most important thing. We can't change others. We can only change ourselves in our response to the situation that we're having. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Will.